The Oregon Trail was a very extensive trail from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City on the Willamette River, reaching roughly 2,000 miles. Most of the pioneers took 4 to 6 months to cross the trail. During those 4 to 6 months, many hardships came. Some of those hardships were disease, drowning, accidents, and many more. The reasons for moving were religion, farming, escaping debt, and business.
During the time of the Oregon Trail period, conflicts occurred. One of those conflicts were the journey to the Martin's Cove, the Mormon handcart tragedy of 1856. In August 1856, in Florence, Nebraska Territory, 2 immigrant companies left the Missouri River to start a late-season crossing of the plains. These companies are a part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon companies. The families on this trip pushed and pulled 2-wheeled, shallow box handcarts. After only a few weeks, the cart's wood began to shrink and crack, while poorly greased wheels shrieked. The survivors reached Utah Territory 4 months later, but on the way there, more than 200 immigrants died during the winter in Wyoming. These immigrants of 1856 were British and Scandinavian converts on their way to the new Mormon homeland in Utah. The ones to first arrive found Salt Lake City in 1847, but a decade and a half before, this was increasingly violent persecution in New York, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. By the early 1850s, the church in Utah began to actively seek converts in Europe. The leaders of these churches organized a smooth transit system involving chartered steamships, riverboats, and later railroad passages from East Coast to central Iowa, which went up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. In the mid-1850s, drought and famine struck Utah, so the church leaders urged traveling immigrants in 1856 to use handcarts to save money, since they had a loss of wealth that supported the travelers. Rations for said travelers were only 1 pound of flour per person daily, plus any meat shot on the way. They could only have 17 pounds of luggage. 1 or 2 people pulled the cart while other family members pushed behind or walked alongside. Due to this time-consuming process, 3 other cart companies already crossed the plains to Utah far more quickly than that year. As you can see, the main difference between these crossings and those of Willie and Martin companies was timing. The cart companies that crossed late had to deal with the harsh winter season and the declining amount of food supplies, even though temperatures became warmer later on. Deaths still occurred. The people that survived had to leave behind heavy clothes and bedding since personal baggage was reduced to 17 to 10 pounds per person, so their party would move faster. In the late summer, supply convoys from Salt Lake City were sent but failed to meet the immigrants. The records are a bit sketchy, but it appears that these supply trains, after waiting some time for the expected handcarts, turned back when the immigrants did not show up. But later on, in early October, missionaries returning to Utah from Europe passed the Willie and Martin companies on the trails. They arrived in Salt Lake City and reported that the 2 large parties were still on the way. Church President Brigham Young and his counselors in Utah immediately sent relief parties and wagons well stocked with food to find the late-coming companies and bring them in. On October 19th, the Martin Company headed towards Independence Rock and Devil's Gate on the Sweetwater River. That day, a winter storm struck. Both companies were left in the cold with barely any food. On the same day, rescuers found the Willie group on the Sweetwater River near South Pass, but only half of them stayed. This was due to the fact that the rescuers had to find the Martin group. On October 28th, 3 scouts from the rescue party found the Martin Company about 100 miles further east at Red Butte on North Platte. In the 9 days since the freezing river crossing, the Martin Company, exhausted and nearly out of food in the bitter cold, had moved only a few miles. A scout later noted that 56 people in the Martin Company died during that time. Rescuer Abraham Hanks later wrote, "The starved forms and haggard countenances of the poor sufferers as they moved about slowly, shivering with cold, to prepare their scanty evening meal, was enough to touch the stoutest of heart. They hailed me with joy and inexpressible. There was only 1 day's quarter rations left in camp." Hanks and 2 other scouts got the Martin Company to move 60 more miles to Devil's Gate. There, the rest of the rescuers waited for them at some abandoned traders' cabins called the Seminole Fort. Due to the exhaustion, exposure, and lack of food, the immigrants of both Willie and Martin companies were weakened and died after the rescue efforts had begun. A mile or 2 east of the Sweetwater from Devil's Gate, the Martin Company camped in the rocks of a small cove to give some shelter from the wind. 2 small Mormon wagon trains that were closely following the handcart company, meanwhile, arrived at Devil's Gate about the same time. By that time, though, people with these trains were in bad shape and nearly out of food, but better off than their handcarts. As a result, the carts and the wagon trains were emptied of most goods and left the traders' cabins and guarded for the rest of the winter, while the weakest members of the Martin Company ride the rest of the way in the empty handcarts. With the help of more rescue parties sent east, the Willie Company finally reached Salt Lake City on November 9th, and the Martin Company on November 30th. There were 67 deaths in the Willie Company, a rate of around 14%, and 135 to 150 in the Martin Company, a rate of around 25% of the company's members. This journey was by far the worst non-military disaster on the immigrant trails. Of the 60,000 or so immigrants who traveled to Utah across what's now Wyoming before the completion of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1869, about 3,000 used handcarts. Still, the image of countless pioneer families pulling handcarts across a trail has become a symbol central to the LDS Church's sense of the power of its faith.
Dr. Marcus Whitman was born September 4, 1802, in Rushville, New York. He died November 29, 1847, in Wailupu, Oregon, now known as Washington. Marcus practiced medicine in Canada and New York. Afterwards, he offered his services to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. After getting another missionary, Samuel Parker, they were sent to investigate the possibility of establishing missions in Oregon country. After finding the Flathead, Nez Perce, and other Indians, they entered present-day Wyoming. Parker kept west while Marcus went back to New York for more recruits and assistance. He met Narcissa Prentice and married her. She was also registered with the Mission Board. They both set out west and were accompanied by another married couple, Henry H. Spalding and Eliza, his wife. 2 single men were also with them. They reached Fort Vancouver, now known as Vancouver, Washington. Marcus and his wife were on a white man mission. It was one of the most horrid tragedies on the Oregon Trail. The mission was in 1836. The reason for the mission was to help the Cayas Indians in Wailupu, 6 miles 10 kilometers west of present-day Walla Walla. The men of the mission helped the Indians and taught them many things. Some of the things they helped the Indians with was building houses and tilling their fields. The wives also established mission schools. In 1842, the board decided to leave its missions at Wailupu and focus on those in Spangcoke, Washington. In the winter of 1842, white men went on a 3,000-mile trip on horseback to Boston to protest the board's choice. After persuading mission authorities to carry on support of the Wailupu mission, he went to Washington to advise federal officials of the circumstances in Oregon country and the potential for settlement. The officials agreed to letting him return. When Marcus returned, the Cayas were cold towards him. His task was even more difficult, having lawless white newcomers. Marcus went looking for his family after coming back, but before he could, a widespread disease of measles broke out. Both white and Indian children were infected, and Marcus cared for them equally. The white children recovered while the Indians did not, lacking immunity, and died. The Cayas suspected Marcus caused the outbreak to remove the Indians and have the land for the whites to settle. The Indians killed 14 white settlers, including the white men, on November 29, 1847. The white man massacre focused national attention on the difficulties the white settlers encountered. The Cayas War did not end until 1850, and the White Man Mission National Historic Site near Walla Walla will remember these pioneers.